Hi, everyone. I'm Jean Meserve. Thanks for joining us for the Water Summit. We're so glad that so many of you have joined us from all across the country to join in this conversation. 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, most of it oceans, but the oceans are facing some challenges. One, climate change is rising sea levels, and secondly, pollution. Those two things in combination are creating an environmental and public health crisis. But that's not all. There's also a crisis when it comes to drinking water. An estimated 2 million Americans do not have consistent access to clean drinking water. And think of that in the time of COVID, when one of the principal public health recommendations is that we all wash our hands. Those are the topics we're going to be discussing here today. We're going to be talking about why these problems exist, who's affected by them, and what we can do about it. And towards the back part of the conversation, we're going to be talking to two leading oceanographers about specifically what they are trying to do to save or improve the world's oceans. Before we go any further, just a couple of words to thank our sponsors. A thank you to Tide and Cascade for sponsoring the Atlantic's journalism. We do, of course, want to hear from you. We want you to participate in our conversation today. You will see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use that to submit your questions. If you could please keep them short, keep them sweet, keep them on topic, and tell us where you are watching from. That will be great. We will get to as many of those as we possibly can. And now let's jump in. Our first guest is Mark Edwards. Mark is a civil engineer at Virginia Tech. He was one of the leading scientists who uncovered the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and he's recently been focused on why the pandemic makes the need for clean water that much more important. Mark, thanks so much for joining us here today. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So first, let's talk, if we could, about this intersection of clean water and COVID-19. You've described it as a catch-22. What do you mean?
Well, I think that our grand challenge of water in the 21st century has always been a kind of complicated nexus of access, affordability, sustainability, hygiene, comfort, and control of waterborne disease that really affects every American. And your subsequent speakers are going to address each of these important topics. But, many of us really do take clean water and modern plumbing for granted. And for most of us, it's only when these systems do not work, they fail, and we realize that without a means of bringing clean water into our homes and communities and transporting waste away, that modern civilization does not exist. And so, let's remember from whence we came and, where some Americans find themselves now. It's just this last century where we've really wiped out the scourge of waterborne disease that were attributable to fecal contamination of water supplies. And for a privileged majority, that's no longer an issue. And, our water industry does a really, really good job of providing pretty high quality water for extremely low prices. And the cost.
But not everybody has it, right?
Generally,
2 million Americans?
Yeah, generally at a third of the cost of our cable bill, but millions of Americans do not have access to that. They're not part of that privileged majority. And when you're in a pandemic, you realize just how important it is to have access to basic hygiene that is so critical.
Is hand sanitizer an adequate substitute for running water in this situation?
Well, it's a start. It's a substitute, but it's not as good as having an ability to a warm water bath and regular comforting showers and with all the hygiene benefits that go along with that. And so if you have millions of Americans that either have had their water shut off or never had access to that modern plumbing convenience in the first place, of course, they're at risk. And, the water poverty that you see in these cases, again, it shocks the conscience. And to some extent, even if we're just looking at this from a selfish perspective, it affects all of us because you're not only judged by how you treat your most vulnerable, but all of us are at risk from the behaviors of everyone else.
You mentioned in your first comments waterborne diseases. Is there any indication that COVID-19 is spread through water?
Not so much. The water is disinfected. It's very good at getting rid of viruses. And so I think our water systems can be viewed largely as a protector, wherein just regular hygiene is going to help reduce the overall significance, just like all the other distancing, social distancing, and mask wearing that's going to have to be part of our response.
How do we find ourselves in a situation where this many Americans do not have access to water or to clean water?
To some extent, it reflects the fact that our job was ended incomplete, wherein, again, the vast majority of Americans did benefit either through having an adequate private well or being part of a regulated public water supply. But there's always been, we did get it down to the point, there's been about 2 million Americans or so who don't have access to the plumbing. And then there's really the growing problem that, in fact, is the key driver behind Flint and what occurred in Denmark, South Carolina, and other places around the country, where a lot of our poor red rural communities or blue post-industrial cities are losing population. They simply don't have enough money to follow federal safe drinking water law, and that puts them in the uncomfortable and unconscionable position of telling their consumers that their water is safe when it's not. And so in those communities that they can't afford their existing water system, the likelihood of shutoff for those who cannot afford to pay is very high. And of course, once that happens, if it happens, they're in the exact same position as all those folks who never had access to modern plumbing and modern clean water in the first place.
The American Society of Civil Engineers rated America's water infrastructure as getting a D, and the estimates of how much it's going to cost to upgrade that infrastructure, the numbers are just startling. In a time of budgetary stress, stressed additionally by COVID, what's the likelihood that we're going to see the kind of investment in water infrastructure that's needed to address the problem?
You know, it's really unfortunate these water systems are out of sight and out of mind, because if people saw what these pipes look like and how much waste and water was lost through them, we would fix this problem in a second. I mean, you see the problems with the roads. If a bridge collapses or your car hits a pothole, but you don't really see the disease or the loss of money that's occurring through these leaky, old, antiquated pipes. You don't really see the consequences of elevated lead in the water, Legionella, unless there's a disaster like Flint where it's brought to the public attention. So, you know, because there's never a ribbon cutting ceremony when you replace an old rusty water line or a lead pipe, we tend to fix those things that are visible. And unfortunately, you know, for that reason, we fix on failure. We fix when we have no choice, when the water main actually breaks. And this is the least cost effective way of dealing with the problem. And unfortunately, once you're in that mindset, especially, you know, in our poorer communities, you know, you're wasting money, but that's how you roll. And it's hard to get out of that fix on failure mentality.
I've even heard that in at least one major American city, there are still wooden water pipes in use. That's how old some of the infrastructure is. And I've seen an estimate that it's going to take $1 trillion of investment over the next 25 years to upgrade things to where they should be. It's not going to happen, is it?
It will happen, but it will happen after all these pipes break and you have no choice but to fix it, or else you go without the water. And so even though, again, that's least cost effective, that is our modus operandi, and I wish it would change, but it will happen.
Let's talk about Flint. You were intimately involved in the exposure of what was happening there. What's the status of the water supply in Flint now, all these years later?
Well, the water has been meeting federal safety standards now for lead and other issues for about 3.5 years. But there's widespread deserved distrust about the water. There's still a dependence on bottled water because of the justifiable fear there's still a fear of the water for bathing because the disease Legionella, which is a disease of modern plumbing where these bacteria grow in your buildings, killed 13 people, and there were fears of other bacteria in the water as well. So it's really a sad story, and it just illustrates once the trust is lost, even with hundreds of millions of dollars of external money, it's not easily regained.
So in Flint, the threat was lead. There are many other threats to water supplies in different locations, aren't there?
Yes, and actually the most underestimated danger in Flint was bacteria, Legionella. It was one of the largest per population outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease in US history, with 13 deaths, and probably hundreds of more people were ill from it. So yeah, this is an emerging problem that we're trying to deal with, whereas lead is one of the older problems. It's a legacy of bad decisions made oftentimes more than 100 years ago. And we're trying to deal with both of those, as well as a lot of other worthy goals that we have for improving water quality and access and affordability in the US.
Mercury, arsenic, forever chemicals, those are some of the other things. Sewage, right?
That's all on the list, and sewage has always been foremost on our concerns.
Are there technical solutions to some of these problems? For instance, a new filtration system that takes care of things in a way that existing filtration systems don't?
Yes, while nothing's perfect, we do have filters that are available to remove the lead at the point of use. We do have treatment systems that can be employed at the water treatment plant and in the homes to improve the microbiological safety of the water. So the issue really comes down to how much do you want to pay? And the other big issue is, do we have a shared common good approach, or is it an every person for themselves approach? And what I mean by that is, in the aftermath of Flint, many of our poorest Americans, in justifiable fear that they are next, they're spending an inordinate amount of their budget on buying bottled water or home treatment systems to protect themselves. And if that money were used and were instead spent at the water treatment plant to improve the quality of water and safety for everybody, we would all have access to cheaper, higher quality water. But there is not a sense of investing for the common good. And unfortunately, we are devolving into an every person for themselves. I will protect myself and my home using my fancy water treatment system, regardless of how screwed up my city may or may not be. And in most cases, the cities are doing a fine job, but once the fear is out there, once you've gone beyond a few bad apples and you realize it's not just Flint, but it's other cities as well, everyone starts to live in fear that they might be next.
Mark, you put a lot on the line professionally to expose what was happening in Flint. Have you tried to get access to other communities to do testing? Have you been able to do it?
Oh, yes. At any time, we're probably working with a half dozen communities, and you don't hear about them because we generally show that the fears are not justified, that in fact the city is doing their job and doing it quite well. And at least based on our ability to do the testing, they are not living the next Flint. But on the other hand, we've shown in too many communities that the laws, in fact, are being broken, and the cities cannot afford to fix the problems that they have. And then you're in an awkward position. What do you do? Because in Flint, hundreds of millions were mobilized to provide relief, to help replace the lead pipes. And without a highly publicized disaster in which there's government culpability for what occurred, you don't have the deep pockets to get the system fixed. And so you really have to be careful about what you find and how you approach it, because again, these systems are financially strapped, and we don't have a system for getting them money to help them follow federal law without a federal disaster declaration.
Let me ask you about federal law for just a second. The Trump administration has moved to weaken the Clean Water Act and make changes to the National Environmental Policy Act. What do you believe the impact will be on drinking water of those changes?
Well, I think it's just, really a continuation of what we've seen for decades. And again, these pipes are out of sight, out of mind. And unless there's a disaster or they fail, people tend to forget and move it down to the priority list. And we're always talking about it, and rightly so. There's something else of higher priority. It seems like it's in the news, but this corruption and this corrosion of our water system really does undermine a key founding pillar of our civilization. And once trust in that is lost, it's very tragic.
We do have a question from one of our viewers. Rick Bacon asked, do your 2 million who do not have access to safe drinking water include those not in a community or public water systems, for example, Native nations?
Yes.
It does, that number does. Okay.
Yes.
Couple of other questions here. Look like several of them are about oceans, but here's one from Pavan. Pavan, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the last name. I'm sorry, but it's too much of a challenge for me here. Pavan asked, the nation is facing $1 trillion infrastructure backlog for drinking water and wastewater. What are the strategies to make this a national priority?
I don't know, because, if Flint didn't cause it to occur, then I really wonder what will. And so, what I'm now in a mindset of is, how do you manage decline? How do you manage the fact that these cities that can't afford to meet federal law, that can't afford to upgrade their systems to meet modern standards, how do you deal with their decline? Are they destined to just become ghost towns? If so, what do you tell people who are left in those situations and who have to deal with it? My first rule is you should not be telling people that their water is safe when it's not. And following that rule gets you in all kinds of trouble. We could get out of it through a national program of investment in infrastructure and look at water as a human right. But we're not there now, and I'm doubtful that we'll ever be there.
We hate to leave on that grim a note, so let me ask you to empower the audience. Are there things that we can do, each of us who are listening to you, watching you here today, that might help address the issue?
Sure, all these problems are solvable. There are technical solutions, and we are going to pay for it one way or another. The only question is whether we do it in a smart, proactive way where we invest in for the common good, or whether we have an every person for themselves mentality and people start installing home treatment systems and wasting their money on bottled water.
And Mark Edwards, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here today with your experience and your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. And for our next conversation, I'm going to turn this over to the Atlantic's Robinson Meyer. He's going to lead a conversation with Radhika Fox. Fox is CEO of the U.S. Water Alliance, and also Miguel Luna, who is a board member of the Water Education for Latino Leaders. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you. And Radhika and Miguel, thank you so much for being here today. And for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about the clean water crisis. Radhika, I was hoping, you could both start by telling us a bit about what you do and why the issue of clean water is so important to you. Radhika, why don't you go first?
Happy to. And Rob, thank you for the opportunity to join this discussion. I have to say that your COVID tracking project is outstanding. I'm kind of obsessed with it. So thank you for making that data available to all of us.
Absolutely, thank you. There's a lot of volunteers behind that, but yeah. It's an honor to be a part of that project.
Yeah, thank you. So I work for an organization called the U.S. Water Alliance, and what we're really focused on is getting everyone in this nation focused on why clean water is essential to our nation's prosperity and community well-being. And I was so glad that we started the conversation today with this 2 million folks who in this country that don't have access to clean water. And what is so troubling is that number is only the 2 million people that don't have flushing toilets in their home, and they don't have faucets where clean tap water comes out. But that number is actually even greater if you think about the millions of other Americans that have drinking water sources that don't meet EPA standards, or the millions more that are struggling with paying their water bills and affordability challenges. So the challenge is truly a crisis. And what we're really trying to do is work with community leaders, water agencies around the country, the federal government to fix that.
What does that work look like on a kind of even day-to-day basis?
So at the local level, we partner with water utilities to really advance policies and practices that get at issues of affordability, so that water bills are affordable. It's about how do we make infrastructure investments that get at multiple goals of both fixing the aging infrastructure that Mark just so eloquently spoke about, but doing it in a way that also makes systems resilient to climate change. It's about advocacy right now, frankly, in Washington, D.C., to make sure that any relief and recovery package includes the needs of low-income people, communities of color, and water agencies.
I want to get to the advocacy question in a moment, but first I want to bring Miguel into the conversation. Miguel, can you talk a little bit about what your group does and why the issue of clean water is important to you?
Yeah, I grew up hearing stories from my dad as he grew up very poor in his town. He would tell me stories of having to go around town collecting sawdust from sawmills to compact them into molds of that would be fire logs that would use to heat up water, to cook, to bathe. And hearing those stories really had an impact on me. My dad would always say that, he didn't grow up with a formal education, but no matter your beginnings, you always have a responsibility and you can always contribute something to society, that it is our duty to do so. As a board member of Water Education for Latino Leaders, an entity that seeks out to educate those local elected council members, supervisors, school board members, water board members, it's important. We think that everybody has the knowledge. I'm starting to learn that not one person has the answer or the solution, and that what is important is collaborative networks, so that we can find the answers together. One of the programs we do is Untapped, which seeks out to educate the local elected specifically on certain issues happening in their local regions throughout the state of California. And Mark earlier was talking about the infrastructure and the need to repair that. But I think we also have to look at the social infrastructure, because we can fix the physical, but if we're not looking at really fixing how we collaborate, how we educate ourselves, how we learn each other, and how we need to care for the thing that most important. We can do without petroleum, we could do with other resources, but water is this one thing that is so precious. So for me, it is a must that we engage in these issues. I always think about how in school we teach subjects, and I think that's important, but we also have to teach our children, and us as adults even, continue to learn how to be better beings and how to have this dialogue, because water left alone, it will heal itself. Water left alone, it will find a way to do that. But if we as humans are going to interact with it, which we will and which we want to, then we have to learn how to have better understanding of who we are as each other, so that we can protect this resource that really protects us.
Well, you mentioned repairing the social infrastructure of communities. I know organization often works with monolingual Spanish-speaking communities. Like, what does the outreach look like there? What kind of work are you doing to improve that level of social infrastructure that you just talked about?
You have to build trust, right? I think there's such a high level of distrust around, and rightfully so, right? When sometimes government fails us, as it currently is at the federal level, I believe, we have to build trust. And the only way you build trust, again, is to be able to get to know the person. You know, these times have become very challenging because, you know, to the lessons of Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross of how to engage with community, you have to learn each other's story. You don't always have to be in agreement with somebody, but you have to be able to understand where they're coming from. And you have to be able to hear their story and share yours as well. And I think that is something that's hugely important in Latino communities, is being able to trust someone so that the message is something that can be augmented. And it's difficult at times. That's one thing. The other thing, I always say that I work on three things. I work on water, I work on people, and I work on smiles. And the last one is a metric that we really see in our community, because when things aren't good, you walk around and you could see the frowns. But when you see the smiles, that's a metric that you're on the right track. And so I think working on that last metric is an important one. And in these times, it's become very difficult. So we have to uplift those good stories while we're doing the work that we're doing to make sure that everybody has access to clean, potable, safe drinking water.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Radhika, I want to touch on something that we've kind of been dancing around in the conversation so far, which is, I think there's a sense, I am an environmental reporter when there's not a pandemic. And I would say there's a sense that in the 1970s, we had the country as a whole had a clean water problem, that there was a lot of open polluting, people dumping chemicals into bodies of water. And the Clean Water Act has addressed much of that. Obviously, the rivers aren't lighting on fire anymore. Can you give us a sense of what what is the nature of the clean water crisis today? What are the biggest problems? What should people think about when they hear the words clean water crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rob. So I think the clean water crisis, it's multifaceted, right? So on the one hand, if you look at the history of how our water systems developed, it was very haphazard. So, we as a nation sort of thought about this highway system, right? And we developed an interstate highway system that was very coordinated. When it comes to water, what happened was, we had expansion into the West. So there was a settlement here. We built a water system around that. And as a result, we have a very fragmented, inefficient system of water management in this country. We have 55,000 drinking water utilities, 18,000 wastewater utilities. And so that is one of the big challenges or crises that we face. And especially with COVID, right? It's compounding because many of these small systems don't have the financial resilience to be able to continue.
And how does that fragmentation affect water quality? Is it that they're not affluent enough, or is it that basically everyone has to purchase the same equipment over and over? They can't share access to water resources?
All of those things. It's the economies of scale challenge that we face. And now in the context of COVID-19, a lot of these small systems are reporting that they don't have the financial resilience to go 6 months if they don't have assistance from the federal government or from the state. So that is a huge challenge. I think another cause of the crisis is that, as Mark was talking about, this infrastructure is aging. I'm calling in from San Francisco today, and we literally have red brick pipes underneath this global city because they were put down in the gold rush era. So the infrastructure is aging. The federal government is an absent partner. We only get 4% of our need of the need for water infrastructure from the federal government. And I think it's important, especially at this moment, and the COVID tracker that you and many others have really been looking at the racial inequities embedded into everything. And we see that in water too. That 2 million number, what we know is that race is the single biggest predictor of who's going to have water access in this country and who isn't. So African Americans have a disproportionate lack of access. They're also dying at a rate of 2.5 times the national average when it comes to COVID deaths. if you look at the Navajo Nation, 30 to 40% of the Navajo Nation doesn't have drinking water in their homes. And they also have one of the highest per capita incidences of COVID. So it's all—
And what does life look like when you don't have drinking water in your home? Are people walking to communal wells?
You are walking to wells, you are hauling, there's trucks that haul water to your community if you're lucky to have that. You're buying bottled water at outrageous prices. That bottled water during COVID has not been in convenience stores in these rural communities. So it is a hard existence.
How is, Miguel, I want to toss the conversation to you. How is COVID affecting your work, and how is COVID affecting your outreach too? Because obviously there's a lot of work that used to be done by social organizations, by nonprofits, that is now just impossible because it was face-to-face work.
Yeah, it's interesting because as COVID is impacting more the communities, the poor communities and communities of color, so is the issue of delivering clean water. I would say though that we are resilient communities, and so the approach of working together, right? It's we're all in this together, and you see the work that's happening around providing food for your neighbor and for others. You see people who they themselves don't have enough for their families, but somehow they figure out to get enough for their neighbors as well. And so I think this issue of how the outreach has impacted, we continue to do what we've always done, which is stay in touch with each other. It's harder because the technology that's available, not everybody has access to. But we forget about this other technology that's the telephone, right? Just to pick up the phone and call someone. We don't have to get on a visual conference call to get a hold of somebody. And so being able to text someone, being able to call someone, being able to drive by someone's house just to check in on them is very important. It's important to come back to those things. I also wanted just to mention that there's this issue of premise plumbing that's coming, and we look at the large infrastructure that delivers water to our homes and to the buildings, medical buildings and schools, but there's this plumbing underneath all those facilities that we don't have a plan for. And that is the next, in California, we have a human right to water that was passed in 2012. We're almost 10 years in, and we're still working towards making sure that there's teeth in it and that there's funding.
And when you say a premise plumbing, in other words, there's aging infrastructure kind of built into the ground floor of these buildings, and that is not part of the public infrastructure that we discussed.
That is not part of the public. Yeah. This is going to be something that the owner of that 100 dwelling building, that if that person currently is a slumlord, how do you think? And there's no money for it. So I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about, and many others here at the Luskin, UCLA Luskin School of Public, they've been thinking about this as well. So while we need to do the macro, we also need to keep in mind the micro infrastructure that if they need to go in parallel. So I just wanted to highlight that's something that we also need to be paying attention to.
That's really interesting. Radhika, you mentioned during earlier answer that city budgets and these fragmented water systems are starting to be affected by COVID. Can you talk us through what the real world implications of that will look like? Is this something we saw during the Great Recession? Like, what does it mean? What does a budget crunch mean for a city water system or a fragmented water system?
It's going to be a compounding crisis on what we're already seeing is the short answer. But, what we are seeing as far as water utilities around the country, they are seeing tremendous revenue losses as office buildings remain closed, convention centers are closed. The projection is that by 2021, the water utilities will see about a $30 billion loss in revenue. At the same time, they're seeing increasing costs because they're putting moratoriums on water shutoffs, which they should absolutely be doing. They're restoring service to people that don't have it, and they're taking on all kinds of new costs related to emergency operations. So revenue is declining, costs are increasing, and then again, the federal government is only contributing about 4% to the needs. So I think what will happen is that at the local level, water agencies will have to increase rates to be able to cover costs, to be able to make capital investments that will further increase the affordability challenge for working families, low-income people, communities of color. And then I think, what I really worry about, Rob, is that we're going to defer those capital projects that aren't the immediate needs. They're not the sewer pipe that broke today, right? It's going to be, we're going to defer the investments to manage for things like sea level rise, flooding. And so we're just going to be kicking the can down the line, or however you want to say it. And so that is, I think, the real worry, is that there'll be a compounding crisis of another public health challenge because we're going to continue to defer that investment and that maintenance.
And those levels of very high investment capital infrastructure, those were obviously supposed to, not obviously, but those were supposed to be one of the, a goal of the Trump administration, these big infrastructure investments. I am familiar with what I've seen from my beat, but is that something you've seen looking at the country overall? Have we seen this wave of infrastructure investment?
No, we haven't. Unfortunately, I think that was one of the areas that at least the water community was excited about under this administration. I will say it's been a disappointment. And frankly, it's been a disappointment that Congress has also not included water in any of the relief and recovery packages. For example, the Atlanta airport received, close to $250 million in stimulus support. What did the water department in Atlanta receive? Nothing. And it's not to say that the airport isn't important, but what is more essential than water? I do feel optimistic about the Build Back Better plan that was released by Vice President Biden last week. I hope that
this is his infrastructure plan that includes some climate aspects too, I think.
Yep, climate, energy, infrastructure. And what I really hope is that as we move further into the general election season, that we're going to see robust infrastructure plans, not only coming out of our presidential candidates, but also in state races at the local level. And it's really, I think, an imperative for us to, as citizens, to talk about what's at stake if we don't invest.
Thank you. Last question is a question from a viewer. He says, it's Thomas. He says, to get to collaborative networks around water infrastructure and other community requirements, I believe that we must have a shared goal of promoting public benefits. How do we get there? And I want to ask you to answer briefly, Radhika first and Miguel, not only how do we get there, but where should we go on water? If there's one thing that we could be doing, what is it, and how can we get that public spirited-ness behind it?
Miguel, would you like to go?
Sure. I said this early on. I think we have, it's sort of, the answer is sort of within the question, that we have to be able to work collaboratively. Water will take care of itself. And there is really not one thing other than, if we're not taking care of the less affluent person, of the poor person, of the person of color that doesn't have the resources to have clean, affordable water, then, what is the long-term benefit of it? And we, Mark or someone else was alluding to earlier, this can't be about, ourselves. This has to be the shared good. What is the shared good? And without water, the issues are just going to be exacerbated without clean water, more specifically.
Radhika and Miguel, thank you so much. We're going to leave it there. Thank you for joining us today. And now for our conversation about preserving our oceans and our ocean health, I want to introduce Janice Searles Jones, who's the Chief Executive of the Ocean Conservancy. Janice, welcome. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Moving from a kind of water that we drink to a kind of water that we cannot drink, how are you feeling about the oceans today?
Let me say one thing following Radhika and Miguel. It is really, I'm very grateful to the Atlantic for actually connecting both parts of the water cycle, because the ocean is a hugely important part of the water cycle. 97% of the planet's water is actually held in the ocean. So when we think about access to clean water for communities, when we think about a healthy ocean and everything that we need and rely on the ocean for, making that connection between fresh water and salty water is really important. So I'm very grateful to the Atlantic for doing that for this panel. And I would say it is all connected. We need systems to protect the entire water cycle for all of us, and the ocean in particular is in trouble, in particular right now, because of the same kinds of pollution concerns we've been talking about earlier, and because of climate change. And so putting some attention on the ocean right now will reverberate with some of the clean water discussions we've been having as well.
I want to ask you what may seem a very preliminary question, but I think is important to establish as a baseline. In what directions are the oceans moving right now? Are you feeling more optimistic about them? Are you feeling more pessimistic about them? Where do we stand on ocean health today, and where are we going?
I'm going to say it's a little bit of both. So the ocean has been an incredible buffer for all of us when it comes to climate change. And so the ocean really is what makes life on the planet possible. It's what makes terrestrial land habitable. The ocean's absorbed about 30% of emissions, and it's also absorbed about 90% of the heat. So it's really protected us a great deal from emissions thus far. But that buffering role and that buffering impact has had a real cost on the ocean. So you have this background impact of warming ocean temperatures, of increasing ocean acidity, and those things are quite concerning. And that is compounded by the more direct human impacts on the ocean: overfishing, pollution, habitat destruction, and things like that. So from how is the ocean doing standpoint, there's some very, very, very concerning things that have implications for all of us and how we are all going to manage in this changed world that we all live in now. But at the same time, I do have a lot of optimism because there are so many more people who are making connections to the ocean, who are interested in ocean conservation, who are rising to the climate challenge and including oceans in climate action, and so many more young people in particular coming into thinking about the ocean and ocean conservation, that I think that there are very real opportunities going forward. So while the background is not great, the future could be if we actually harness all that energy and really point things in the right direction.
Speaking about the background, what has the Trump administration done or not done on oceans? Have they made any policy? Have they reversed policies that you think were important?
So the Trump administration has put almost the entire outer continental shelf potentially up for leasing for oil and gas development in a moment in time where it really doesn't make sense to double down on fossil fuel investments and create additional fossil fuel infrastructure. The Trump administration just recently announced a rule to roll back decades of interpretation of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a very sane statute that Congress passed in the same era as the Clean Water Act passage, that basically says if you're a federal agency and you're taking a federal action that might significantly affect the quality of the human environment, you actually have to think about the impacts of that action. You have to disclose them to the public. You have to consider public comments. And then you need to choose. You don't have to choose the best option. You can still choose an environmentally damaging option, but you still have to allow the public to contribute to that decision, and you have to lay bare what those trade-offs and considerations are. So it's a look before you leap statute, and it's incredibly important, particularly in the ocean space, because the ocean is overwhelmingly federal. Most of what happens in the ocean is regulated by federal entities. And so asking those federal agencies to actually think about the impacts of their ocean, of their actions, and then ask the public what they think, is hugely important, and this administration is pulling that back and potentially really reducing the consideration of cumulative impacts of climate change, of other things that are incredibly important for the ocean right now.
Whenever we talk
examples, there are lots more.
Whenever we talk about federal ocean policy or federal climate policy, really, there's always this question: well, are states doing things? As you just mentioned, the oceans are overwhelmingly federal, and not even every state has a coastline. So, are there state policies that you think are moving in the right direction? Are there state policies that have made the situation worse?
States have been a real bright spot, actually, when you're asking about the optimism, pessimism continuum.
Is that on climate or just on oceans?
On climate and oceans. And
Yeah.
one of the things I will say is ocean and climate are really inextricably linked now. You really can't solve one without the other. And so not considering ocean when you're thinking about climate mitigation, when you're thinking about climate adaptation, you're really missing an important piece of the puzzle. And so I'll use the West Coast states as an example. They have done a lot of thinking about ocean acidification. As an example, ocean acidification is caused when carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, and it ultimately makes the seawater a little bit more acidic, which makes it difficult for ocean creatures that basically use calcium to form shells to actually do that. And so it has huge impacts for commercial fisheries, for the food web, and so on and so on. And the West Coast states have really banded together and are thinking carefully about what they can do within their own jurisdictions to actually reduce the impact of ocean acidification in their local waters. They are thinking more comprehensively about climate and different things that they can do to reduce their local emissions. And so the states on both coasts really have served as real bright spots in this moment of time where a lot of climate regulation is being pulled back. They're real viable models that those states have banded together and put together that really serve as examples that hopefully will be able to transition to federal policy at some point in the future.
On oceans acidification, I think that gets at something that people might not understand, or is that always clear? I mean, that seems a very clear place where the health of oceans is connected to climate change. Are there others that we should be thinking about?
So in addition to ocean acidification, ocean warming has huge implications for the health of the ocean. You see fish stocks moving, so they're migrating to find temperatures that are more suitable for what their biology evolved to. But when that happens, you don't have always a match between prey and predator, so you may not have the food sources that you need. You see corals in particular having significant trouble with ocean temperatures and with ocean acidification. Corals are incredibly important habitat structures in the ocean. They have about 25% of the biodiversity in the ocean, even though they're a real small percentage of the ocean floor. And for communities that are based around corals, they have storm surge protection, they provide food, they provide jobs, they provide livelihoods, they provide recreation. And so they're incredibly important parts of ocean ecosystems and of human communities. And with warming, they expel the symbiotic algae that they need to survive. And so you see—
They fall apart, basically.
Yeah, you see an erosion and you see the coral skeletons instead of those vibrant coral communities. So those are sort of
I think when
examples.
people hear corals, two examples. Okay. When people hear corals, I don't know, I think of the Great Barrier Reef. Are there coral communities like that in the United States?
Absolutely. So Florida is a great example where you have the Florida Coral Reef Tract, which is one of the most remarkable places in the United States in terms of having corals. So the Great Barrier Reef is extraordinary by any dimension, but there are a lot of important coral reefs that are smaller, but equally important to communities and equally important to that marine biodiversity in the United States as well. And there are incredible cold water coral communities too, up in Alaska and in deeper waters that are really important habitat for fish, and they support commercial fisheries as well. So even the ones that you can't snorkel above in warm water or dive in warm water, deep sea corals are also really remarkable areas of biodiversity.
One last science question, and then we can go back to policy. Does sea level rise affect ocean health? Because I think when we think of sea level rise, which is another ocean impact we were just saying, when people think about sea level rise, it seems to affect people more. I don't know. We imagine submerged hotels and condos in Miami Beach. but does that affect the health of the animals and plants and creatures that live in the ocean?
One way to think about it is the ocean, blue carbon is one way to address climate change. The ocean is not just a victim of climate change, it's also a powerful source for solutions, and blue carbon, natural solutions, is one of those. And seagrasses, mangroves, salt marshes are really important sources of habitat, carbon sequestration, and they help stabilize shoreline communities. And as sea level rise increases, you're having some of those shallow waters flooded. And so you're losing these really important habitat components that help buffer seawater, that help buffer ocean acidification, that provide a habitat. So you're basically, if you think about the ocean as a series of habitats, you are migrating the ocean and all of those ocean communities out of their habitats onto areas that are not permeable anymore, and things like that. And then the other piece of that to think about is as sea level rise increases, you may be moving into areas where you have more pollution going into the ocean. If you look at some of the predictions, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, and look at the amount of oil and gas infrastructure that is likely to be submerged when we get out in the out years of sea level rise, you're putting a ton of hydrocarbon production underwater, and that will have pollution implications for the ocean as well.
What is the biggest, is there a pollutant that you're more worried about now than any other? And I'm going to say you can't say carbon is the answer.
Okay, dang it. I'm actually going to give you a class of pollutants, which is contaminants of emerging concern. There are some that we definitely know are particular problems. There are
these plastics? Are they from a certain kind of industrial process?
Oh, so I'm glad you mentioned plastics, because then that makes my answer even easier. Because in my head, plastics are carbon, and plastics are like a slow motion oil spill. So if I can put carbon back on the table, from carbon dioxide to
you can put carbon, yeah, plastic, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, plastics would be top of the list right now. About 8 metric tons of plastics go into the ocean every year, and scientists estimate that by 2050, there'll be as much plastic as there will be fish in the ocean. And plastics exist in the ocean, and they just mechanically get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you're seeing plastics at every level of the water column and all the way down into the sediments. And everybody's probably read about how plastics already in our salt, in our beer, in our water, in our fish. Plastics are definitely top of the list after carbon dioxide.
And they get smaller and smaller, but they don't go away, right? So you can have these extremely small microplastics that remain chemically plastic.
That's right. And we don't really, it's really ironic in sort of the progress that we have made as a society. We've ended up using this incredibly durable material for an incredibly ephemeral use. And so we're living with the legacy of that production and those choices for a very long period of time.
I want to go to a question from a viewer. Anthony Santiago asked, what local or municipal level policy levers do you see as standouts or examples that more cities or states should follow?
So one example I'll use is the use and application of pesticides. Adding to my sort of slow motion oil spill analogy for plastics flowing into the ocean, I'll use Florida as an example. You've seen a real proliferation of harmful algal blooms, and you sort of have this this overlap between climate change, which is creating warmer temperatures, and then fertilizers running off into the ocean. And it's doing in the ocean what it does on land, right? You have this burst of productivity, you have fertilizes the ocean, a lot more plant life, which then dies, sinks down to the bottom of the ocean. And then as bacteria consume that, you suck all the oxygen out of the ocean, you get these huge dead zones. So there's a lot of work being done in some communities. Miami, I will use as an example, where they're looking at different ways and all of the levers that they have to actually educate individuals, but also work with larger companies and properties and things like that about how you actually apply all of those things on your land to avoid them ending up in the ocean and having those harmful algal blooms, which can affect fish, humans, dogs. I think everybody's seen from all of the Florida examples a couple of years ago, can have a huge impact on quality of beach life and also marine life being able to survive in those zones.
And that's also, the fertilizers are, in contrary to climate change, a local issue too. So that can be mitigated. I mean, rivers are very long, but that can be mitigated at more of a local level than some of the climate issues we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for local entities is to recognize the background climate change still needs advocacy. And so there are things you can do around climate change in your communities, but then the next lever is to try to create as much, we were talking about resilient communities before, and think about resilient communities for the ocean to create as much resilience in the system as you can so that it can still function as the climate change impacts are happening. And so that is looking at other sources of pollution and really trying to reduce as much of the insult that's happening on top of the climate change injury, if you will.
What, in your view, can individuals living in those communities do about water pollution or about climate change?
So I'll say two things. There's an interesting debate, I'll say, on Twitter and in other places about the relative importance of individual action and whether or not that adds up to anything. And so what I always tell people is wear the ocean on your sleeve. If you're someone who cares about the ocean, and if you like to breathe, you should care about the ocean because every second breath we take comes from ocean plants. And so the ocean is important to everybody. Wear the ocean on your sleeve and make sure that you advocate in your community about the ocean and why it is important to you. It's always really important for elected officials to hear about the concerns of their constituents. Even if they are with you, they still need to hear from you. So that's one thing. The second thing is that individual actions do matter and they add up in a cumulative way. Collective action can help shift things, and that's really important too. But then for me, the most important thing is to aim up and advocate up because there are the changes that we need to make, whether it's for provision of clean water to communities that don't have access to it, whether it's for reducing pollution into the ocean. Those are larger systems. And so it's really important for all of that individual impact to aggregate up and to push for policy changes, investment changes, system changes up into your municipal and your state and your federal communities.
What does the mountaintop on oceans look like to you? What does the place where, what should we be aiming for thinking about in ocean policy? Is it a big new federal law? Is it a way of looking at the oceans? What's the goal?
So a couple of things. One is that the ocean has been, to take the pollution analogy, and we've been talking about pipes and clean water, the ocean is the end of the pipe. It's ended up sort of being the ultimate externality for all of our pollution, whether it's carbon pollution, whether it's plastic pollution, whether it's pesticides and fertilizers, it all runs into the ocean at some point. And so part of it is having a completely different mental shift about externalities and who bears the cost of pollution.
Externalities as in externalities to markets. Externalities to the kind of things that we think about costing money.
Thank you. And as Veronica and Miguel were saying, communities of color disproportionately bear those costs across a lot of different dimensions, and particularly the pollution dimension. So part of it is just thinking about who should bear those costs and what role we all have in making sure that those costs aren't borne disproportionately, and how to figure out how to price those costs into markets so that markets can actually support all of that. So that's one thing. The second is that because the ocean, what did Mark say? Mark said something about sort of like out of sight, out of mind when it comes to when we actually figure out how to intervene. In some ways, the ocean is the ultimate out of sight, out of mind. As long as the waves work, most people think the ocean is just fine. And so we need to fundamentally rethink all of those ocean systems, recognize how much we need them, and then actually apply some protection into the ocean. So there's a large global movement right now to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. And I'm sure Sylvia will talk about that later. And it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle to make sure that we're building some resilience into ocean systems and some refugia where places have more sustainability than just sort of the open ocean, because the ocean is sort of treated as the ultimate commons. And it has borne a lot of human activity for a very long time without having compensatory protected areas or compensatory protections.
One last question to be answered in a number. You said we were trying to preserve 30% of the oceans. What percent of the oceans are preserved right now?
It depends on whether you're talking about fully protected or protected in any means. It's less than 5%, and less than 3% is fully protected.
Wow. Well, we're going to leave it there. And Janet, thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it back to Jean and the great Sylvia Earle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, a session brought to you by our underwriter, how easy habit changes can reduce in-home water usage. Please welcome Shannon Quinn, Global Water Stewardship Leader on behalf of P&G for Tide and Cascade.
Hi, everyone. I know we've all been stuck at home and kind of navigating through these difficult times, and I really wish that we could all be in the same room today, but on behalf of P&G, I want to share how grateful I am for the opportunity to connect with you, at least virtually today. And thank you for taking time to be on probably one of your many virtual and video calls you'll have today and this week. I'm very honored to be joined by some of these amazing leaders in the world of water, and I'm excited to participate in these discussions with you today. I've already learned so much from the previous speakers, and I'm looking forward to hearing Sylvia Earle's her point of view in the next session coming up soon. I just wanted to take the next couple of minutes to look at water from a slightly different angle than some of our previous speakers. I want to bring it home, kind of literally, and focus on how easy habit changes can reduce in-home water usage. Please remember that the question and answer function is open. So along the way, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in there. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And I'll try to get to some at the end. Just to start, a little bit about me. I spent my early years trying out different environmental careers. I had experiences and internships in government, within universities and nonprofit organizations. And all of those experiences brought me to the role that I'm in right now as Procter & Gamble's Global Water Stewardship Leader. And in this role, I guide the development of the corporate and brand water policies that we have. I also helped create innovative assessment processes that we use across the company, and I cultivate strategic external partnerships that will hopefully better prepare P&G and the planet for the future. If I can be honest with you just for a second, I really never saw myself working for a large corporation, but the impact that P&G can have with the help of the 5 billion people that we serve each and every day, it convinced me to at least give it a chance. And so now, nearly 10 years after I decided to take that chance, I'm still working to help to integrate sustainability into our everyday business. Every week, my goal is to help P&G and our brands innovate products and consumer outreach activities so that we can ensure that with every wash and every clean, the households we serve can make more sustainable choices. Now more than ever, with all the time that we're spending at home, I want to shine a spotlight on how each of us can make a difference even during simple everyday household chores. I think we all know why we've joined the call today, that water is an essential part of life and it's a resource that needs to be protected. And you also probably are familiar with the fact that agriculture and industry withdraw the majority of the world's fresh water. But there's another area that each and every one of us is responsible for, and that's in-home water usage. I just want to kind of set the stage with a few stats. You're likely familiar with them, but I think when they're all said together, it helps kind of prove why within the home we can all start to make a small difference that adds up to a large one. So global water consumption has increased twice as fast as population growth, and 2/3 of the world's population live in water-stressed regions, and they will live in water-stressed regions by 2025. More people are using more water in their homes than ever before, In fact, domestic water demand grew 600% since 1960. And this means that in-home water usage is increasing at the fastest rate compared to other sectors, including agriculture and industry. In the US, we're using the most water per person per day compared to any other country in the world. And the average American family uses more than 300 gallons of water per day at home. And as staggering and maybe overwhelming as those statistics might be, they all come from before the COVID-19 lockdown. So it should be maybe no surprise that with all of the stay-at-home orders being enforced around the world, it's the coronavirus pandemic has driven a 50% water usage increase in the United States and 24% of an increase in energy consumption. And every day, especially spending extra time at home, we're busy, our minds are in other places, and we're not always set up to assess the water energy footprint of our homes. And so sometimes we're unknowingly participating in behaviors that increase our environmental footprint. The great news is that there are simple and surprising ways that each and every one of us can reduce water consumption and lower our overall environmental impacts, including the way that we clean our dishes and the way that we clean our clothes. So the global reach that I talked about before, kind of the reason that I'm here today and representing Procter & Gamble is real. And we have brands that connect with people all over the world every single day. And I think that myself and others working within P&G understand the role that we can play in making sure that we're not only designing products that are more efficient, but that we're creatively educating and inviting our consumers to take advantage of our water saving and efficiency technologies. I'd like to talk about 2 easy habit changes that can help reduce water use in the home. One is in the kitchen and one is in the laundry room. So I'll start in the kitchen. So since 1955, Cascade has been innovating products and its methods to improve dishwashing and to reduce water consumption. In fact, it's the first brand that was able to create a detergent that allowed people and consumers to skip the pre-rinsing phase or the pre-rinsing of dishes before they had to be put into the dishwasher. And one thing, since I started kind of working in the space specifically with P&G and working with Cascade, that I was shocked about was that the dishwasher is actually designed to be more efficient than the way that most of us hand wash our dishes. According to Energy Star, certified dishwashers use less than 4 gallons per cycle, and the sink can use upwards of 4 gallons every 2 minutes. So then I kind of started to ask myself, and you might be too, well, how many dishes do you need to make the dishwasher a more water efficient choice? In a recent study where Cascade went into people's homes, they found that the average person is actually spending 15 seconds hand washing a dish. And in that time, the sink uses half a gallon of water. That's why running your dishwasher with as few as 8 dishes is all it takes to save water. Now, first, I want to recognize that the most efficient way to run your dishwasher is to have a full load. But in that research, what we also found was that most people hand wash dishes while they're waiting to fill their dishwasher. And that is actually leading to wasting water without even realizing it. People want to do the right thing, but sometimes they just don't know. And so knowing this, Cascade recently launched a campaign called the Do It Every Night campaign in February. And this has really been a way to educate and inspire people to change their behavior so that they can do what they really want to do, which is make a difference from their homes. So yeah, do it every night. You might be chuckling a little bit, and I hope you are, because we know that using just a little bit of humor can go a long way in helping to inspire change. My husband and I, in fact, we look forward now to doing it every single night, and it's a habit I intend to keep as we start to venture out from our house, hopefully in the near future. Okay, so let's move from the kitchen to the laundry room, or in my case, the basement. It's fascinating to watch P&G scientists innovate every day. They look at the products that we have, they think about how can I make these more sustainable while they also work really well. And just in general, the science that goes behind every pod and every bottle of detergent is just incredible. And the Tide HE Turbo, or the Tide High Efficiency Detergent, is one of those products that can help make doing laundry a lower environmental impact activity. What it does is the technology actually reduces soap bubbles in the washing machine, and that helps to then reduce the rinse cycle time, and it helps you save between 10 and 20 gallons of water per cycle. This innovation reduces wash time, while high quality, that high quality product that's been innovated by those scientists reduces the likelihood that you'll have to rewash your clothes. And this helps avoid doubling the amount of water and energy needed to get your wardrobe ready for the week, or maybe you're, just sitting in front of your computer all day like me. We work in partnership. We really need these detergents and other products to work with the machines that they're being used in. And so if we can really get the formula and the machine technology right the first time, it allows people to get this essential household job done with a lower impact on the environment. Okay, so those two examples I really like because they're win-wins, both for the environment and for you, kind of saving time and getting to spend time with your family, or other activities outside of the home, maybe in your backyard or in a park. And I hope that you found them interesting as well, and maybe you can take a look at how you've been doing your chores and maybe make these simple changes so that you know that you're doing something, even if it's from your home. So thanks very much for all of your attention. These water issues are very important, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion into the future. I think we all have a part to play, and we can start in our homes, and even in the smallest way. I think we're about at time, but I did share my contact information. I think at the end of our sessions that will be shared, and I'm happy to take any questions offline. And I look forward to hearing the next session. So back to you, Atlantic.
For our final session today, please welcome Sylvia Earle, the president of Mission Blue. Back to lead the conversation is Jean Meserve.
Unmute there. There we go. Great. Wonderful to be back with you. And Sylvia Earle, such an honor to be here talking to you. Have read about your work for decades, and I'm thrilled to be here with you. Let me start with this. If you were a physician and the oceans were your patient, how would you grade their health?
Ocean, you're in trouble. We really need some help. We know what to do. We just have to do it.
Let's talk first about the trouble. We heard earlier from Janice Searles-Jones, who talked a little bit about ocean health, talked a lot about warming and acidification. I've heard them called the evil twins when it comes to ocean health. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, we have looked at the ocean with gratitude for soaking up the warmth, soaking up the carbon dioxide. That doesn't mean that it's gone away. In fact, it's generating additional problems. It's bought us some time, perhaps, but we humans have not really been attentive to what those problems really mean in going forward. We just seem to take the ocean for granted and think, as we have thought throughout our history, the ocean is simply too big to fail, that we can't harm the ocean, except now there's plenty of evidence that we have. Well, we've invested so much in going skyward and understanding the world from looking down upon ourselves from high in the sky. We've neglected the ocean. It's costing us dearly that we have, in ignorance, put so much into the ocean, and we've taken so much out of the ocean, just assuming that it's going to be okay. The ocean is too big. For us mere humans to alter its nature. But now we have the evidence.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that evidence. I'm an ocean swimmer. I know where I swim. I've seen a difference. I've felt a difference. There are certain animal species that I saw when I was a child that I never see now. You, of course, have a real scientist's view of this. When you dive, when you're around the ocean, what changes do you actually see?
Well, people ask me sometimes, where is the best place in the world to go diving? and I say it's almost anywhere 50 years ago, that the changes are so rapid. Our ability to alter the nature of nature through the combination of what we have put into the ocean, from excess carbon dioxide to all of the things that you heard about in the previous presentation from Janice Searles Jones. I mean, she really put it out there, the avalanche of plastics that did not exist when I was a child. Now they're everywhere. It seemed like such a good idea at the time. All of the pesticides, the herbicides, the things that, again, seemed like such a good idea when they came on the market, but we have overdone it and not understood that when those chemicals flow into the sea, they don't just go away. The other part of it is what we've taken out of the ocean. It has profound impacts, not just on individual areas, but on, it relates to climate, stripping the ocean of wildlife. Now, Janice talked about blue carbon, but she focused on the plants, the mangroves, the seagrass meadows, the marshes, which is all really important. But the biggest green on the planet is actually out there in the ocean. The tiny little organisms, phytoplankton, that generate oxygen, capture carbon, and drive the great ocean food webs. Every single living thing, of course ourselves included, we're all carbon-based units. When we take fish out of the sea, and shrimp, and lobsters, and clams, and oysters, all those things, we've overdone it. I mean, we're talking about huge quantities of life that have captured and hold, and when they ultimately go the way of all living things, they sink to the bottom of the ocean, sequestering carbon. We've broken those links. We've broken the food chains by taking the sharks. 90% of the sharks that have been around for 400 million years are now suddenly in serious trouble. We look at the tunas. Nobody really seriously thought of tuna as something that would be an important thing for humans to eat. When I was a child, a few people did. But now the appetite through marketing has become so effective that bluefin tuna, as in particular, has dropped from where it was when I was a child. In the Pacific, the number under 3% of what was there in the 1980s. In the Atlantic, similarly, it's not just the big tunas, the bluefins and the yellowfins. It's the fish that we take generally that we put on our plates. We think of that as just like farming. You know, we harvest the ocean, except we're not harvesting the ocean. We're out there like hunters, as predators. We are stripping wildlife. We used to do that with birds. We don't do that anymore, but we do it with the ocean.
We're stripping a lot of it and not eating all of it. A lot of it is just bycatch, right? It's just
Habitat destruction in the way. You know, I'm not anti-fisherman. I'm a great champion of, I see local communities, I see the long history of working with the ocean, but that's not the case anymore. They're industrial fleets that are out in the high seas and even in the coastal waters of this country and around the world that are taking far more than the ocean can replenish.
You've talked about creating what you called ocean hope spots. First of all, what are they? Explain.
Well, not a new idea, but it's maybe a new twist. That is protecting the ocean the way 100 years ago, a little more than that, in this country and around the world, having parks, protected areas where we respect the wild things, serves as a model of how a healthy system actually works. And it gives back to all of the surrounding areas. We don't have enough of the land really embraced with care, something on the order of 15%. We ask a lot of the land, trees, all the rest, to generate food, to generate oxygen, to capture carbon. But the ocean does the heavy lifting in terms of maintaining, safeguarding the basic processes that make Earth habitable, driving the climate cycle, the carbon cycle, driving the water cycle. That's what we're talking about today. It's where most of the water is. It's also where most of the water goes into the atmosphere and then falls back on land and sea. So how much of the ocean is protected? Well, again, you heard Janice answer that question if you were listening, that overall it's, about 2% of the ocean is safeguarded so that even the fish have a safe haven. That means 98% of the ocean is open for exploitation.
She also mentioned a 30% figure. Is that your goal as well? How much of the ocean you'd like to see protected?
Well, I put it this way. If you think of the ocean as the blue heart of the planet, and it is, how much of your heart do you want to protect? Well, 2% is definitely not enough. The goal this year, the United Nations, has been 10%. That's a good start. Actually, if you conclude all the forms of protection, it's a little north of 7% has some form of protection, only about plus or minus 2% fully protected. 30% is a goal that is now endorsed by the United Nations and many organizations and individuals around the world who really think that we can get there. 30% by 2030 as a milestone toward at least half of the land and sea by 2050. But for me, I say, look, you have to take seriously all of the ocean, all of nature, and protect it as if your life depends on it, because, it really does. Hope spots are really like national parks, like the protected areas that we do have in the ocean. And this country, and I'm in California right now, this state has, independently of the national policies, developed a network of fully protected areas in the coastal region under state jurisdiction, which is a really thoughtful and a positive thing. But not all places that are worthy of protection are in great shape. It's a good place to start. Places that are already in good places that are like they were 50 years ago, and you can find such places.
I saw somebody describe this idea of sanctuaries. They weren't talking specifically about your hope spots, but the sanctuary idea. They described it like taking an aspirin to treat brain cancer. And it wasn't enough.
No, but it's a big, important tool in the box. And for example, among the really healthy places that are hope spots are the waters around little island country of Palau. Diving there, it really is almost like diving 50 years ago. You see some changes, but that country has protected 80% of their entire exclusive economic zone, where even the fish are safe. 20% is used, but it's used with care. Suppose the whole world, including the high seas, that no nation independently owns, it's the global commons.
How would you police it? It seems to me there are an array of forces working against you. The fishing industry, the shipping industry, the mining and extraction industry. How do you politically and economically make it happen in this world?
Economically, it should be a no-brainer. We're subsidizing fishing. We're subsidizing oil and gas. We're now looking at the biggest land giveaway on the planet with deep sea mining issues in the high seas. Why are we continuing to make the same mistakes that have gotten us into this terrible place that we are today? If we turn those subsidies into something positive for the fishermen who really need some help to transition to another way of making a living, although the biggest problems are not our local fishermen. The biggest problems are the high seas. It's illegal. It's the unreported, it's the unregulated, but it's also the legal fishing that is being allowed under the cover of we need to eat fish for food security. It's just an illusion. Nobody in Chicago needs to eat a bluefin tuna. I mean, we don't. And the methods that are used are terribly destructive. And it isn't just tunas, it's wildlife, wild animals that have a place in the ocean, a critical place for the carbon cycle, a critical place also for the nutrients that they give back to the ocean that fosters the growth of phytoplankton that generates the oxygen and captures the carbon. You know, these seem like big nerdy ideas, but one of the things that we need to really get over is, hey, this is easy stuff if you think about it. Kids get it. I mean,
it takes international cooperation, though, doesn't it? And is the world on the same page here, or there just such a diversity of opinions and economic stakes that it's hard to mobilize and get forward traction?
Once you understand and see it, you cannot unsee it. And there are solutions that really require mostly restraint of a lot of talk on this water discussion. All of it is about personal choices. Suppose you just give up eating tuna. Is that a big deal for you? Suppose, it's the marketplace. One of our partner organizations with Mission Blue, we have more than 250 partner organizations, this network of hope around the world, more than 100 hope spots with champions all over the world. But one of them is Wild Aid. And they say when the buying stops, the killing can too. You have the power of choice about what you wear, what you eat, how much water you use, how you live, times 8 billion. It really stacks up. So our appeal is really to you as individuals, and you, how you vote, you, what you support, and ultimately the laws will change. Right now we have laws on the books that were formed back when we thought the ocean was too big to fail. We have agencies that support marketing wildlife from the ocean. I mean, what's with this? We know better. We just have to do better.
I want to get to a couple of the audience questions. We're almost out of time, but I want to squeeze these in. One person asks, our oceans have been heating up, something you've discussed. Is it too late to change the trend?
Well, we can't go back to what was, but we can go make things better than if we just do nothing. We know the trajectory if we just business as usual. That's not good enough. We have to do everything we can to begin to move in the right direction. There is time, not a lot. We really have to take it seriously.
Another question, has the pandemic cleaned up the oceans? I'm an open water swimmer and see here in New York City a change, cleaner water. And is it temporary? I know the air pollution that cleared up for a while is now coming back into play.
I think the most important message that came to us is, a lot of people say, oh, it's not about us. These are natural trends. And, oh, there's nothing we can do. It's just too big. A few weeks and whales are coming closer to shore because there's less noise that would normally, offend them and keep them away. Our behavior has resulted in cleaner skies because, we've begun to shut down a bit. And in the ocean, well, it's a mixed story because the government, in an attempt perhaps to respond to a demand for whatever, opening up the ocean that has been protected to additional fishing. Like, no, it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. We've made some progress toward embracing the ocean with care, keeping safe havens for fish, even fishermen get it, who are really looking at the future, that, you know, yes, we can go out and take more fish now, and then it's over. We
Sylvia, I
need
want to try and
more
squeeze
fish.
one more question in. What factors are preventing world leaders from taking responsibility over the negative human impact on the oceans?
Well, the key is knowing. If you don't know, you can't care. And if you just believe what's the messages from 50 years ago, that the ocean is infinite in our ability to keep producing whatever we want to take and accepting whatever we want to put in, we have to use our voices, those of us who see. And I've had thousands of hours underwater actually seeing the difference. And all of those of you who know, use your voice. Don't keep it to yourself. Scientists are pretty good at not communicating with the public as effectively as now we must. I mean, divers need to stand up and say, you've got to come and see what I've seen. And once you know, it's hard to unknow.
And that is a wonderful place to end this conversation. Sylvia Earle, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for doing what you are for the water.
And that concludes this year's Water Summit. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks for submitting your questions. We hope that sometime soon we're going to be able to be with you actually in person, but until then, we will continue to do virtual events. Next Wednesday, we have the Power of Purpose Summit. It's about corporate social responsibility in the age of COVID-19. You will be getting an email about it, or you can look online to powerofpurpose.theatlantic.com. Hope you'll be there. Thanks so much for watching today.